with Ronnie Munck, who is the organizer of the conference. And Ronnie is one of the very few people that I've ever come across that sits at the intersection of international development and labour studies, and has also done an awful lot of work on social movements. And we all know Ronnie's work from the very first session that we did, where you were all asked to review one of his pieces, which I haven't yet told him about, but maybe I'll send him some of the reviews. And I wanted to ask Ronnie to talk a little bit about how he has been able to draw on these intersections between international development, labour studies and social movements, starting perhaps from the first time that he was able to use these different perspectives to come across different analyses, different understandings of what is going on with work, with workers. So Ronnie, can we start please with what you were telling me about in the 1970s with those plane trips to and from Montreal?
Thanks, Fenella. Yes, it's a very large agenda you're opening up there. I guess I could come at it with maybe a few snippets. No, you're quite right. It's in the mid 1970s, I think, where there's the first breaking of the hegemony of the industrial relations tradition. So there'd be a number of researchers coming from really what in those days would have been called Africa studies or Latin American studies, and students of labour and trade union movements. And they would have come together, and the people like Robin Cohen, Peter Waterman, and then myself would have been the drivers of what we were trying to call the new international labour studies. So at the time we were saying, well, labour is international, labour is gendered, labour is more than people working in factories. So something fairly obvious if you come from Nigeria or you come from Argentina, in my case. So that created quite a stir and quite an interest for a while, and it was brokered by a journal in Canada called Labour and Capital and Society, that not many people know about. It also brought together, for the first time, brought out of South Africa the group of, I suppose, industrial sociologists who founded the South African Labour Bulletin. People like Eddie Webster, Johan Marie and Ari Citas. So the three of them got together with Robin, Peter, myself, and a very sort of engaged dialogue and series of publications ensued from that. But the main thing was that we weren't coming from the industrial relations tradition, but we were engaged in labour studies, and we were trying to forge this new paradigm for understanding labour from a majority world perspective, I suppose, right, as you would put it today. My analysis now was that you're talking about mid to late 70s. My analysis now was that we were too late in the sense that the radical wave of the 60s was over. So in that sense, we weren't, we were in the doldrums politically, but also we were too early because the whole globalization study, globalization labour, was only going to come maybe 5 or 6, 7 years later. But if you go back to that sort of literature, I did a book called The International Labour Studies. Robin wrote a book called New Helots and a number of others. And what we were trying to do there was break down the boundaries between area studies and development, and, if you want, the more traditional industrial relations approach. And it's probably worth revisiting, because I mean the key thing there is the breaking boundaries. And if you looked at the three of us, Robin, Peter, myself, we'd all be migrants of one sort or another. Right. I suppose when you migrate personally, you find it easy to migrate between between disciplines, or you're not so much stuck. Well, you have other experiences. Yes. And if you're sort of monocultural, mono-ethnic, don't have a passport, and then you absorb national traditions in a different way. Yeah. But that's hypothesizing. And that's neither here nor there at one level. But I mean, I think there's interesting work there. More recently, I've seen it myself in relation to the debate around the precariat. And like a number of people, was very enthused and interested when Guy Standing's book on the precariat was serialized in The Guardian, or this hit the media big time. And at one level, we'd all say, great. But there was very little in it that hadn't been said in those debates in the 70s, right? Yeah. And in a sense, when you begin then to deconstruct the way it was posed, the precariat, you see a lot of problems. Because what Guy does is he posits his idea of, I think, basically British labourism. That's what he has in mind as being the traditional working class, traditional labour. And then he says, look, there are all these new layers coming about of precarious work and so on. Again, but he's thinking of IT people who don't have stable jobs. If you look at it from a majority world perspective, you go to Brazil, you go to South Africa, people have never had this stable employment with national insurance and health service. So the madness of trying to look at labour without a development or without a global perspective came home to me there. And a number of people have remarked, and I think in South Africa they became disenchanted with this idea of precariat once they began to absorb how it's facile to call it Eurocentric, but it is in the sense that it comes from, it assumes that model of labour and the working class. But those would be the types of boundaries I think you'd be wanting to
break down. So that's right. And the other area that's very interesting to explore is this area of social movements and how social movements are becoming much more important in our understanding of how work is organised, and how that's actually quite a break with some of the more traditional industrial relations models, which concentrate very firmly on trade unions and organised labour. We have a phrase, are we talking about organised labour or organising labour? And so that perspective has also been quite important, I think, to bring into our study of industrial relations, of labour studies.
Absolutely there. I suppose, again, you have partitions between labour studies and social movement studies, or this idea of old social movements, which are labour, nationalism and feminism to some extent, some people say, and then new social movements, peace, sexuality, the new issues. Well, they're not really new issues, particularly, are they now? But I think that's wrong. I personally got over any sort of boundaries I had in my head in South Africa from the early 90s on. I was travelling a lot and then worked for a couple of years in South Africa. And what became clear was that the emergence of the independent black unions was inseparable from the broader social struggles in the townships and so on. And you have very, very interesting debates there. For example, one in the 1970s, early 80s, between the workerists and the populists. Very, very interesting debate. So the workerists said, we're trade unions, workers in Mercedes-Benz and in Durban or Johannesburg are workers like anywhere else. We have to organise proper trade unions, proper industrial relations. The so-called populists were ones that said, no, things are quite different here. People live in townships, they have housing issues, they have transport issues, and they developed what you might call social movement unionism. And that's where you break that boundary. In South Africa, Brazil, in a different way in India, you've always had that social movement unionism. So not a trade unionism that's not kept within narrow industrial relations. So, I mean, you have to have broader perspectives than Western Europe or Britain or the US. But the US, funnily enough, in relation to migrants, they're way in advance of most places. SIU, a union on the west coast of the US, service public sector employees, began to organise Mexican migrant cleaners and had very successful campaigns. And that led to the whole renewal of the US trade unions. So when trade unions engage with sectors other than their traditional supporters, it does interesting things to labour. Because the old way of labour, the old trade union style politics is no longer really viable.
And it often doesn't meet the requirements of the people that we're trying to work with. And so, brilliant. Well, thank you very, very much. That's really, really helpful.